frequency distribution is classes and frequency. However, a lot of times they will tack on extra information for you to find, such as midpoints and relative frequency and cumulative frequency. So let's kind of find everything all at once. So the next thing that they might ask for is what are called midpoints. How do you find the midpoint? Well, midpoint sounds like middle. Well, that's exactly what it means. You want to find the middle of your class. Well, how do you find the middle of two numbers? Well, if you think of two numbers, let's say 10 and 20, you don't think hard, you know the middle is 15. Mathematically, though, how do you find the middle? You take the two numbers, you add them up, and you divide by 2. And that's what this formula for midpoint says, is that you're going to, in order to find the middle, you add the two ends up and divide by 2. You're basically averaging to find the middle. So, for instance, on this first one, I have the first class is from 71 to 81. So if I wanted to find its middle, I would do 71 plus 81 and then divide it by 2 and see what I get, which would get me 76 for my first midpoint. And then I could do the same thing for the second one, 82 plus 92. And then whatever I get for that would need to be divided by 2, which would get me, and without any math, I actually know it's already going to be 87. And I already know what the next one's going to be. It's going to be 98 without any work. How did I come up with 98 without doing any work? Well, that's the trick, is using your class width when you can. I can just go ahead and once I've got one of the midpoints, I can use the class width each and every time, add 11. So what would the next one be? Adding 11 again would be, let's see, 109. And the last one would be 120. What you may want to do is, if you use the little class width trick, is to just go ahead and double check the last one by doing that one by hand. Why? Because then if the last one's correct, all the ones in the middle are probably fine too. So it means you probably didn't make a mistake. Moving along, we'd like to talk about now how to find relative frequency. Relative frequency is basically taking your frequency for the class that you're looking at and dividing it by the total frequency. So it's basically you're trying to find a decimal for your frequency. So remember, we did do this last time. We found out our total group size was 18. So to find the relative frequency for this first class, we take the frequency for that class, which is 1, and divide it by the total frequency, 18. So it'd be 1 divided by 18, which is 0.055. Again, they normally have me turn that into a percentage, so it'd be 5.6%. And again, depending on how they want you to actually round. The next one, you'd find its relative frequency by doing 5 out of 18, because that's the frequency for that class first. And you'd find out that that is 0.277 or 0.2778. So that would round to 27.8%, which means that would be the same for the next class, which also has a 5 out of 18, which would be a 27.8%. And the next class would be the 3 out of the 18, because its class has a frequency of 3, which would, if rounded to the nearest tenth place, would give us 16.7%. And last one, we get 4 out of 18. Well, 4 out of 18 would get us 22.2%. Now, if you wanted to double check what should all of these add up to, they should add up to about 100%. Now, it might be a little bit off Due to rounding, it might be a little bit bigger than 100, let's say 100.1 or something like that. Or it might be smaller, a little bit like 99.9, but it should be very close to 100. It shouldn't be getting something like 102 or something like 98%. It should be very close. So that's the idea with relative frequency, is you're finding the frequency relative to the total frequency and then turning it into a percentage. The last thing that they may want you to actually find out is what's called cumulative frequency. Well, if you think about what cumulative means something similar to like when you have the cumulative exam. Midterms are cumulative. Midterm means, well, add up everything that happened before this point in time. That's what's on your test. For a final exam, it's also cumulative. It means everything prior to the end of the class that you've learned. Everything's included. So same thing with cumulative as in frequency. It means you start with the first class and you say everything before it. Well, when you're on the first class, there's nothing before it, so you just have one. When I hit my second class, that means I'm going to contain it and everything before it, the 5 and the 1, which will be 6. When I hit the third class, I'm going to take it and everything before it, which would actually be 10. When I go to the fourth class, everything it and everything before it would be 14. And the last one would be 18. Notice your cumulative frequency should always end at your total. They should always be working their way upward to your total because it builds. It's like your final exam. Once I hit the end, I should have everything. And that's it. One of the last things that we want to talk about are what are called class boundaries. And normally we have classes that don't actually touch so that you don't have any overlap. But what we want to create are class boundaries. Our classes will just barely touch so that when we make what are called bar graphs later, our bars can actually touch, but we won't actually have to worry about anything getting repeated. So how do we make our classes meet and touch? Well, here's kind of the idea, and we'll use this first example. So I'm going to kind of draw out a number line. So our first class goes from 2 to 5, and the next one starts at 6 and goes to 9, and the next one starts at 10 and goes to 13, and the last one goes from 14 to 17. So those are our classes that range apparently according to this table. Problem is, what we want to find is what are called class boundaries, where we are going to have these touching. So class boundaries. And I want to come up with a whole list of these. Okay. So the idea with class boundaries here is, well, if my first class ends at 5, but my second one doesn't start until 6, how do I get them to touch? Well, I'm going to want them to meet in the middle, which means I'm going to have to push out the right end to get a little bit bigger, and it means I'm going to have to push in the other end to get a little bit smaller so that they meet in the middle. Well, where will they meet in the middle? What's halfway between 5 and 6 is actually, they'll meet in the middle here at 5.5. Okay, so that they'll meet in the middle at 5.5. Well, where will they meet in the middle between 9 and 10 in the next one? Then they'll meet at 9.5. And for the next one, between 13 and 14, they'll have to meet at 13.5. The question is, you're pushing out your right hand ends a little bit further. So, for instance, instead of ending at 5.5, we're going to end at 5.5 on that first class. That means we're going to start the next class a little early at 5.5. And then the next class, we said we were going to stop at 9. We're going to actually start at 9 and stop at 9.5. And that means the next class wouldn't actually start at 10. It would start a little earlier at 9.5. And that means that next class would actually end a little bit late at 13 and a half. But then the next class would start a little bit early instead of 14 at 13 and a half. The problem is you're pushing out your right hand ends a little bit further by a half, but you're bringing out your left hand side to start a little bit earlier by half. So that's going to happen on your beginning and your end too. At the 2 here, and the 17. So the 2 is also going to get pushed out a little bit, and so will the 17. Well, everything is getting pushed out by a unit of a half. So the 17 gets pushed out a little bit by a half, so there'll be 17 and a half. And this one gets pushed out by a half, so it starts a little early at 1 and a half. And the reason why you do this is because just like before, we want all of our classes to be the same size. So if I'm moving all the right-hand sides out a little bit, then I need to even do that on my last class. If I'm moving all my left-hand ends out a little bit to the left, then I need to actually do that on my beginning of my classes too. So these are called my class boundaries. The 1 and a half, they'd be listed out as 1 and a half, 5 and a half, 9 and a half, 13 and a half, and the last one we pushed out was 17 and a half. And that's what you would list out if you were listing out in my math lab. Let's take a look at this last example. This